So why on earth am I a gay-affirming Christian? That's the topic I'd like to unpack today. Welcome to Table Talk, where each week I unpack insights from Christian theology and spirituality that help you become a more thoughtful, calm, and just a downright great human being. My name is Brett Silford, pastor at the Table, a church in Saxe, Texas, and I'm very excited to jump into our topic for today, since it's one that honestly is deeply personal for me. So in this episode, I want to share a bit of my story and why I care about this topic so much. So from the years 2008 through 2012, I went through, there's lots of terms for this, dark night of the soul, crisis of faith, deconstruction, whatever you want to call it. But it was a time of questioning that led to some major shifts in my faith. I've been raised in a fairly conservative Protestant evangelical kind of context. And so for a variety of intellectual reasons, I was really struggling with that kind of approach to Christian faith. Most of my questions and such centered on the Bible and the usual suspects. I mean, I was not amazingly unique. It was, divine violence in the Old Testament. It was the doctrine of hell understood as eternal conscious torment. A relationship to science that was very negative and antagonistic. And so, the thing is, I get those are other topics for other days, but suffice it to say that I began to read a lot. And as I read, I found answers to a lot of those questions. But one insight that became quite clear to me in a lot of my study was that in the last few hundred years, the majority of the American church was consistently on the wrong side of history on a number of very key issues, like number one, slavery and its close cousin, racial discrimination. Number two, women's rights and equality. And so as I read, it became really clear how powerfully our own culture influences our reading of the Bible. In other words, sometimes people will say things like, well, the Bible says, as though they're simply reading the text for its very clear meaning, when honestly the reality is that they are not, and I do not, and you do not. I mean, every sermon you've ever heard, every book or article you've ever read, every teacher or mentor you've ever had, every commercial, show, movie you've ever seen, basically your culture, it gives you and I, you might think of it as like a set of lenses through which we interpret, right? We bring all of that to the text. And this is what makes us, for example, like when we read the Bible, we might emphasize certain passages, right? We might say, now that's the key. Those are the key parts of the Bible, while ignoring or avoiding others. Or we'll say things like, now, what this used to mean, in that historical context, what it meant was, and then we'll proceed to quote a scholar. Often we don't say the scholar's name because we just want to pass it off like it's fact. But we're quoting a scholar who likely is in conversation with other scholars and they might disagree. In short, I think we could all use not just a bit, but a lot more humility when it comes to the Bible, rather than loudly proclaiming what the Bible says or what the Bible means and then proceeding to give our one interpretation as like the definitive interpretation of the text. And so as I studied, I noticed this. I noticed that there are certain ideas which today we just take as like a foregone conclusion that actually were hugely controversial, mind-bendingly strange, and profoundly radical just 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And furthermore, I saw that even certain ideas that we often assume, well, of course the Bible condemns that. If you actually read the text, you realize, oh no. You can actually make a really strong biblical argument for that terrible thing. Like, for example, in our not too distant past, pastors, just like me, would stand up in pulpits and argue that slavery was a God-ordained institution. And I'll probably touch on that passage in my next episode. But the thing is, right, that as pastors like that, they had Bible passages, that would seem to agree with them. In a similar way, church leaders make arguments around women not being, fit for leadership for various reasons. And again, certain biblical texts seem to make those arguments. And so I was reading, I was studying, and it started to dawn on me that the reason the church, as I looked back, right, because hindsight's 20/20, as they say, that the reason the church was consistently on the wrong side of history was not, let me make this clear, not because they were like uniquely unintelligent or uniquely terrible people, but because, like all of us, they had certain ways of reading the text handed down to them, and they simply took that as truth. And what they weren't doing was putting that received tradition in conversation with new information. By new information, I mean both the information you get from studying, right, scholarly works, and so you can understand the Bible in its historical context, because we often think it's an easy transition from a text written 2,000 years ago to 21st century America. We're like, oh yeah, no problem. So that can be one thing I mean by information, but as well as the information that comes to us by honestly just talking with people, hearing their stories, making sense of them. I mean, I suspect if more pastors in the 1800s had a different relationship with people of color, might have had a little more compassion. They might not have been so blinded, right? So I think that's also another example of like information that we need to put in conversation with the biblical text. All right, so all that was happening, and I began to ask myself, okay, so that's what we've missed in the past. Brett, like what are the things, or what is an issue today that your children or grandchildren are very likely, not guaranteed, but are likely to shake their heads and ask, how could you have been so blind? Like, how could you have let the culture and your received ways of reading the Bible blind you? I mean, these are people's stories. Like, did you not hear their pain? How could you do that? And I as I started to think on that, I suspected the thing was going to be around the affirmation of LGBTQ people in the church. And so I began to read and study and research to see, okay, what are the biblical texts on this topic? What are the historical circumstances around those texts? What did they mean then? How does that meaning translate to today, if at all? How do I make sense of those texts in light of the stories of my gay and lesbian friends? And as well as even what are the sciences saying on this topic, right? What are psychologists saying on this? And again, not that I take any one of those as like the truth. Like if I just know what psychologists are saying, then that's the truth. Or if I, have a gay or lesbian friend and they tell me a story, well, that's the truth. Obviously, it's about putting all of those in conversation. And so for me, over time, as I did that, a pretty clear answer emerged for me in my own mind, that I now believe the majority of the United States church is making basically the same mistake with gay and lesbian folks that it made with slavery and women in leadership. As I see it, it's the same song, third verse. Now, sometimes when people hear me say things like that, their eyes get very big, and they're like, Brett, like you are a pastor and a man of God. Like you have influence. Don't you fear leading people astray? And to that I say, yes, of course. That's why, even though at a personal level, this has been like pretty dang costly for me, I'm being straightforward and honest with what I believe, precisely because I think the church is hurting gay and lesbian folks and their families, and in the long run, I think we're even I think we're misrepresenting God's heart. I realize that can sound a bit dramatic, but I really do think this conversation, it matters. It can be life and death for people. So it's one I take very seriously. So with that in mind, over the next 5 or 6 videos or so, I'll be giving just some of my own thinking and approach on this topic. And to be clear, I'm not saying I have some knockdown argument that will convince you all that the Bible really does affirm gay or lesbian people, any more than I can give you a knockdown argument that the Bible condemns slavery or affirms women in leadership. Instead, I'm simply going to offer you reasons that I believe this to be the case. So all that to say, my heart in these videos is I'm not trying to be antagonistic. I'm not saying if you disagree with me, you're homophobic. Even if you totally disagree, you know what? I love you. And I hope you can still love me. And that as brothers and sisters, we can move the conversation forward. So that's all for today. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it, comment below. And to ensure you don't miss out on future episodes, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel or my podcast, most anywhere podcasts are offered, by searching Brett Tilford Table Talk. Grace and peace.